Saya Brian McFeeters. Ini program Money Matters. Jangan kemana-mana.
Good evening and thank you for joining us again on Money Matters. Joining us today we have the US Ambassador to Malaysia, His Excellency Brian McFeeters. Welcome to the program, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure having you with us. Can I start off by asking you that this appears to be your second posting in Malaysia. The first, if I'm not mistaken, being a political counselor at the embassy. So what are your observations on bilateral relations with Malaysia in the past year since your appointment as the ambassador, because your appointment came during the COVID pandemic?
It's such a privilege to be back in Malaysia. My family and I really enjoyed it roughly 10 years ago. I find that everything has gotten more intense, closer relations. The embassy is bigger. We have our three big areas are security cooperation, people to people, and trade, trade investment. And in each area, there's a lot of growth. Just for one example, on the security side, the amount of cooperation between Malaysia and the U.S. has tripled in dollar value terms just since 2017. So very busy and very productive. COVID has been difficult for everybody, but I think we've partnered with Malaysia quite well on that as well.
Right. So in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges that you had to face during your appointment as the ambassador for the first year, was that difficult to handle as well?
I think probably just like every business and every entity, we had our own challenges. We were glad to be able to get all of our staff vaccinated, within a few months and early last year. I think my best day as ambassador was July 5th of last year when the U.S. provided 1 million doses of vaccines to the government of Malaysia. It was at a very critical time in the COVID crisis here. And then since then, I'm very proud the U.S. has gone on to donate, I think, 480 million doses around the world. But just going back to the difficulties, sure, we've faced the same challenges, trying to keep everybody safe, SOPs, obeying all of the Ministry of Health regulations. I think it's been quite clear in Malaysia what's needed to be done, and Malaysia has done a great job vaccinating its population, explaining the SOPs, so it's getting better, I think.
So looking at the pandemic as well, with the trade relations, what was the feedback that you were getting from the States with regards to looking forward at the end of the pandemic?
Well, there's a lot of American companies active here that have invested in Malaysia for years and years, especially in the electronic sector. They were, I think, very grateful to be able to reopen soon after. There was initial closures when the COVID crisis became so serious. But they were very happy to be able to reopen, and now many U.S. companies, companies like Intel and Microsoft, are making new multi-billion-dollar investments in Malaysia. So they're really moving ahead, and I think everybody went through a difficult period, but now they're finding out that they can, move into the future. American companies have a lot to offer Malaysia in terms of, when you look at Malaysia's digital plan and Jendela and things like that. When I read those, I say, yep, American companies can contribute, and they are.
Okay. You've been moving around Malaysia a fair bit because last week you were in Sabah as well. So what was the focus between the embassy and Sabah during your visit?
It's great to be able to travel. I hope to be able to do a lot more travel in Malaysia. In Sabah, we've had a long partnership. It's focused on the environmental area. So we talked about the climate crisis, which is a huge priority for the U.S. government. I think huge priority for everybody, right? Everybody needs to care about it. And we talked to the Sabah state government also about wildlife. We have programs that support combat wildlife trafficking, and also about zoonotic diseases, that can jump from animals to humans. There's concern that there could be another breakout. So we have quite a number of programs. We also, in general, we have these programs around the country, but we talk to the Sabah partners about our exchange programs. We have a number of ways to get typically, or especially young Malaysians, to go to the United States, spend some time, and then hopefully we'll have a long-term partnership with them.
Would you tailor these programs for different states in Malaysia as well?
Well, there's probably different topics. So we have one program we call International Visitor Leadership Program. It's probably our premier program in the sense that the people that go on it go on a specific topic. So if we were to do one for Sabah, it would probably be specifically focused on maybe climate change or forest preservation, and they would meet with experts in the United States, typically go to 3 or 4 cities. So it's very professional, but I want to make clear that all of our programs are open for all the states, and we try to make sure that there's a diversity, both in terms of gender and where people come from.
Okay, so the focus on Sabah is obviously very important to the embassy as well, and for the US as well. So the response from the Sabah state government has been very favorable?
Very much so. We met with a number of officials. We met with Masidi Manjun, the Minister of Housing, who does a lot. I call him Mr. Everything because he seems to do a lot of different things. And he was very generous in setting us up with other people. So we met with the Parks Department, the Wildlife Department. We met with the Youth Council. We met with the Mayor of Kota Kinabalu. And in each case, we talked about programs that we have or things that we want to do together.
Is there any particular reason why you chose Sabah as the first state to do these programs?
Well, I've been traveling, and other members of the embassy team have been traveling, since we could, basically starting in October, November when things opened up again. Sabah is, Sabah I think is particularly important in the environmental side probably because of the climate, focus on climate, biodiversity, things that come together in Sabah. But we're hoping to do, I've already been to Kelantan and Penang, and hoping to do, trips to Sarawak. I understand you're from Sarawak.
Yes.
I had a visit there 10 years ago, and I can't wait to go back. So we're trying to reach out across Malaysia as much as we can.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, hold that thought. We've just got to go for a very quick commercial break. Stay tuned for more, so don't go away. Welcome back, and you're still with us on Money Matters as we speak with the US Ambassador to Malaysia, His Excellency Brian McFeeters. Now, Mr. Ambassador, with the US being Malaysia's second largest investor, do you see any viabilities for both nations to explore new areas in terms of trade as we shift from pandemic to endemic?
Very much so. I think you mentioned investing in trade. I think go together. They complement each other. So starting on the investment side, the American Chamber of Commerce here, I think has about 280 members. They recently did a survey and they got responses from 80 of their members. And among just those 80, there's a total of $40 billion worth of U.S. investment, and they've created 126,000 jobs in Malaysia. And these aren't labor jobs; these are high-quality jobs. So I'm very proud of the fact that U.S. companies are here to make money, obviously, but they also contribute to the the growth of the human resources in Malaysia. Some of these people rise up to be the chairman of the company locally. On the trade side, we have a tremendous back and forth. We have about a $50 billion, about 200 billion ringgit trade relationship each year. It's gone down because of the COVID pandemic, but it will probably recover. We have in the direction from the U.S. to Malaysia, we have things like aircraft engines and computing equipment and high-tech machinery contributing to Malaysia's growth. And then in the other direction, the U.S. is actually a larger importer than Malaysia is in terms of trade. So we have a lot of palm oil, rubber, things like that. But also computers. I think 20% of the semiconductors that go to the United States are made in Malaysia.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the American-Malaysian Chamber of Commerce. So do you think there should be more consultation and dialogues between the respective bodies?
Between the American Chamber of Commerce
and the Malaysian bodies?
I think there is considerable dialogue. Sometimes what we hear from the companies is they have a very good reception when they initially invest in Malaysia. But when it comes time to reinvest, it's a little harder to get that attention from the upper levels of the Malaysian government. So I've encouraged the government to set up some kind of process so that if an American company is either investing or reinvesting, that they get the attention to resolve all their issues. Like one of the companies I talked to recently wants to open a new plant. They're going to employ 2,000 new workers. That should get any government's attention, but maybe they don't always get that.
Why do you think so?
I don't know. I think it's maybe competing interests, or I think there's a sense that when you first invest, the government has a lot of incentives set up, but when you reinvest, it's not quite the same mechanism.
Right. Okay. So can we move on to education? So programs like the Fulbright program and the English Teaching Assistant program already in place. So do you see potential in further collaborations with Malaysia?
Definitely. We talked about COVID earlier. We're hoping that with the recovery from COVID that's going on, we hope to be able to send about 150 Malaysians, again, mostly youth, to the United States on our various programs this year. I think we have about a dozen programs, but just to mention a couple of them, YES is my personal favorite. It's Youth Exchange Study. So we have about 20 Malaysians that just went to the United States, high school age. They go around the country, they live with an American family, go to a local American high school. They learn what's good, they learn what's bad, they learn about the real America. And we hope that they come back and they're our partners, for a long time. And we've seen that. We've seen that they keep up with us. Another one is YSEALI, a Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative. We have it all over ASEAN. And we have, again, we have thousands of those members, and some of them get to go to the United States. During COVID time, we couldn't do it, but now we're trying to resume that. And that's a very interesting program because it's a professional focus. Like you might have a bunch of people that are specialists in things like pollution, and they get together and talk about how are we going to deal with ocean pollution in Southeast Asia. So it's professionally focused. And then I mentioned IVLP earlier, which is a premier program.
What about the English Teaching Assistant program as well? That's already in place.
Well, the English Teaching Assistant Program is a premier program. It's not in place at the moment. It was paused I think about 2 years ago, partly because of COVID, partly because of questions that the government of Malaysia had. So we're trying to reinstate that. At one point, it was active in several states. We had up to 100 young Americans, college graduates. It was good for the Malaysians because they got to learn English from the Americans, but also I think it's tremendous for the Americans. They would go to rural schools. They would come out speaking perfect Malay. I'm envious, because I'm still struggling. And they, and again, I see those Americans as probably having a lifelong tie to Malaysia, and that's what we want. We want as many of those ties as we can.
Right. Can we move on to the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Do you expect adverse economic consequences for Asia?
It's so important to face up to that conflict. I think the whole world just needs to convey the sense, the horror, the unprovoked attack that Russia is carrying out on a daily basis against Ukraine. I think all of us see, horrific attacks every night. So I think the main thing that we need to do, certainly the U.S. government is focusing on, is showing solidarity with Ukraine, showing absolutely no leeway to Russia at all. And in answer to your question, the war is having ripple effects. It's gone on for almost 3 weeks now. The effects are not exactly known because it keeps spiraling out, but I think we all need to be aware that it is going to have effects, on prices and on commodities.
Yeah. So do you think it will have bearing between the U.S. and Malaysia in terms of the trade ties?
It certainly won't do anything to weaken our trade ties, right? That's going to continue. But it might have, unknown effects in terms of the availability of products, effects on the supply chain. People are telling me that, the cost of shipping a container was already high and is going way up. Things like that, I think, are stressing businesses.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, we just got to go for our final commercial break, so stay with us and we'll be right back.
The global equities market was seen to be more lively this week, with global benchmarks such as S&P 500, Nikkei 225, FTSE 100 have been recording considerable gain. Similarly, the FBM-KLCI has gained further strength this week. On Friday, the FBM-KLCI closed 1,591.26 points. This represents 23 points higher or 1.5% increases on a week-on-week basis. The major event this week was none other than the US Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC meeting, whereby the Fed has decided to increase the benchmark interest rate by 25 basis points. That brings the federal fund rate from 0.25% to 0.5% presently. More importantly is on the outlook for the US policy rate. Judging from the latest survey among the FOMC members, it appears that the Fed is expected to raise the federal fund rate from 0.5% to 2% by end of 2022. This would mean the Fed will likely increase their policy rate in each FOMC meeting throughout the year. On a similar note, the Bank of England has also raised their benchmark rate by 25 basis points from 0.5% to 0.75%. Going forward, the equities market would continue to remain uncertain. The main wildcards is the war in Ukraine. How it will evolve is anybody's guess, but certainly the military conflict will exert pressures on the energy prices. In that sense, rising inflationary pressures are the immediate macroeconomic risk, as it will affect the purchasing power among consumers and the strength of the household spending. At the same time, rising global interest rate is also a testament that global recovery has proceeded quite well, which warrants for a gradual removal of monetary policy accommodation. As such, we foresee the FBMKLCI will make an attempt to break the psychological level of 1,600 points next week.
Thank you and welcome back to Money Matters. Now, Mr. Ambassador, the US policies in Asia, do you think that it needs to adjust to the changing realities in East Asia, recognizing the increased role of China, of course, and maturing ASEAN integration, and perhaps even looking at what many people say is America's diminished relative economic influence in the area?
It's a very important point. You know, the Biden administration just released a new Indo-Pacific strategy. It emphasizes, first of all, the importance of free and open Indo-Pacific. That means the ability to, travel in all the airspace and all the waters. And it also means, it also refers to governments, that governments should be free and open. And then the point that probably is most relevant to us at the embassy is it talks about connectivity and partnership. And basically the instruction to me and my team is, you have a strong partner in Malaysia, make it stronger. So we do that, as I mentioned, on the state level, we do it at the national level. Mm-hmm. We're trying to re-emphasize the partnership with Malaysia on issues here and also globally. And then it also talks about items that are familiar, but re-emphasizing prosperity, which is basically what we already talked about, strong economic ties. Again, U.S.-Malaysia, but also the U.S. has about 100 million in cooperative programs with ASEAN on health, lots of cooperation. And then security, we have security ties, particularly in Malaysia, in terms of improving Malaysia's ability to survey its land and its maritime domain primarily.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then the last topic is resilience, which is really a way of referring to COVID. Mm-hmm. So we're emphasizing all those things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Moving on to suspected forced labor practices involving Malaysian companies, which could obviously affect investor confidence. So what further steps do you think Malaysia can take to address this concern? And what type of engagement can Malaysia and the US undertake where this is concerned?
Forced labor is a very important aspect of human rights, which are a priority for the US administration. The steps that Malaysia is taking in terms of coming up with national action plans that address forced labor are very good. I think many observers would say there needs to be more implementation. There needs to be prevention of things like trafficking and prosecution of people who traffic victims. There are steps in that direction. We could always see more. Mm-hmm. I see more awareness on the part of businesses. A lot of people are coming to us and asking us, like, what are the rules that we have to follow? So I think it's getting additional attention in Malaysia, but it's not yet resolved.
Right. So, from what I understand, of course, obviously the issue of cheap labor in Malaysia and Malaysian companies being penalized for methods against the US Customs and Border Protection Agency, because according to reports, we have had 8 companies under a withhold release order by the CBP, but 2 have had their release orders so far. So basically, how is this monitored before the release orders are given?
So the withhold release order is based on US law that says any product where there's a strong suspicion that forced labor was used to make that product, it can't be imported into the United States. Mm-hmm. So it starts at that attempted export level. And then when a company is given that notice, the company basically has to go through a process of communicating with Customs and Border Protection and explaining either that it's false and they're called on to bring in an auditor, a kind of an impartial auditor to show that, or they have to take steps to remedy the situation. We've had companies that have done that.
Mm-hmm. So obviously with Malaysia being a haven for cheap labor, what do you think the Malaysian government should do to further eradicate these inhumane practices? Because, as you mentioned, this also involves private companies. So is it because of lax enforcement by the government?
Malaysia is not the only country that faces this. The U.S., we have issues with trafficking and, with forced labor as well. So I don't think anybody's completely eradicated it. It's up to government to create a structure of accountability, not only laws in place, but actual enforcement. And again, I think that's happening increasingly in Malaysia. It's primarily up to businesses. I think any business, needs to look at its own practices and say, like, are we, treating our workers right? Especially, I think in Malaysia, you do have many workers coming from international situations who are vulnerable to begin with, and then if they get caught up in a situation of trafficking or forced labor, it's just adding misery to already difficult life.
Right, understood. Now, can we talk about climate change and environmental issues?
Sure,
So,
yeah.
the cooperation between Malaysia and the United States, should more cooperation be involved here between the two countries?
It's definitely a priority. I think everybody needs to care about climate change. It's a global issue. We are cooperating quite closely with the government of Malaysia, especially after Conference of the Parties 26 that was held in Scotland last November. We're partnering very closely with the UK embassy here because they have the lead on COP26. We're trying to get two things, I think, in Malaysia and around the world, and that is how do you reduce your emissions, and that's through alternative energy, and the U.S. has both technical and technological solutions, so we have, American companies that can supply products, like things like solar panels. And then also, how do you preserve, in Malaysia's case, very important, preserve forests. Our special envoy, former Secretary of State Kerry, has said, forests are the lungs of the world. We need to preserve them. And Malaysia has a particular strength in that area. So that's something we talked to the government of Sabah about, and I think they're taking steps in that direction. We were very impressed.
So looking at the keeping the forests in Malaysia as well, is this something that you're looking at as well in terms of the other ASEAN countries, or just specifically in Malaysia?
No,
as well?
absolutely, globally, and I think every ambassador in the region would have a program similar to ours where we're trying to develop points of contact on the government. I mean, at some point it becomes kind of technical, right? If you're going to eradicate, if you're going to get rid of methane emissions, you need technical people to come tell you how to do that. So we're trying to set up those ties. And then again, bring in American technology that's appropriate for alternative energy.
Right. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for appearing on Money Matters. It has been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this episode. We appreciate your time on Money Matters. So do join us again next week, same day and time, for more money insights that matter. I'm Zahir Kelvin Ong Abdullah. Stay safe and take care.